Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy the story. This was written by a real human. So please leave a like if you enjoy it to help the channel and subscribe for future content. It's free. Links to the story and Patreon will be in the description. Please go and support the author. Any support is always appreciated. If a human narrator would like to narrate my stories, please contact me. I write these in my spare time between work and my children and just don't have the time or quiet space to narrate them myself. I hope you can understand. Thanks for your time, and again I hope you enjoy the story. And for the love of everything YouTube, this is literature, so please leave my channel alone. Let's get into it, folks. Cats at the Cradle Part 2. Lori watched the shuttle gently grasp their life pod with some sort of tractoring tech. Her mind raced with a million thoughts as she tried and failed to keep her nerves under control. Who were these aliens that called themselves humans? The Great Admiral had ordered everyone before exiting warp not to resist these humans, as they had acknowledged the galactic standard call for help they had broadcast when the warp bubble they had been traveling in started shrinking exponentially as their ships were mauled by the Viril battleship. That ship had methodically destroyed one ship after another. Its captain stayed just outside range of the capital-grade lasers the Orion cruisers mounted and used its long-range missiles to first injure, then utterly destroy 5 Orion cruisers and the only destroyer that managed to survive getting into FTL. They had been trying for several cycles to find an exit so they could leave the FTL lanes without being outright destroyed by the Viril. Then they had gotten hit on the Regent's Pride. The missile somehow managed to tear a hole from port to starboard but missed everything vital. However, many civilians were lost during the loss of atmosphere and the decompression of those areas. The blue and white shuttle steadily towed them into a much larger ship called the Titan 7. The humans had built a giant brick with what appeared to be 100 cargo bays. She thought seeing the massive behemoth swallow other shuttles towing life pods similar to her group. Most of the refugees on her pod were juveniles, a few expecting mothers too far along to be in fighting condition, and a wounded VIP. She had helped a medical officer carry the stretcher onto the pod with the badly bandaged Orion woman. He had hurried off shortly after that, being summoned to assist wounded at deck below the life pods. They went through some sort of shield and she could see other pods opening and the tall human guards in black and gray combat armor escorting other Orions into large clusters near interior blast doors. She found herself wondering again why these humans had decided to help them. She knew they had passed at least 7 other warp gates and broadcast the same distress signal. No one had allowed them entry. So many of the survivors had died on those ships the Viril battleship had destroyed. So many more had died on her home world of Farsi trying to escape the Viril fleet bombardment and the Brood's landing clusters. The Viril, she knew, liked taking slaves for their mining industrial planets. But the Brood only kept non-insectoid sentient creatures around to lay their eggs in. She shuddered involuntarily as the thought wormed its way into her mind. The pod jostled as the tractor fully sat it down and released it. A light above the pod door turned a solid yellow, indicating breathable air, and with a whoosh, the door unsealed and swung outwards. The lights inside were suddenly dim as the door revealed a towering human in a black and gray combat suit. Lori squinted as a tall, imposing human stepped into view, some sort of pulse rifle slung over its shoulder and 2 small lights on the side of its helmet. "Welcome to Sol. You have been granted temporary asylum. Please follow Sergeant Havora to your debrief. Any hostility will be dealt with swiftly and will immediately render your asylum void." The voice sounded male through its helmet's audio, but with this being first contact, the only thing she could think of was how big this human was. It towered over the tallest Orion adult by at least 5 hands. Orion started milling about in the pod as best they could and soon were being escorted to an area denoted for their use as a gathering spot, and 2 more pods groups soon joined them. Lori found herself studying these humans. They had 2 arms and legs, an apparent head and torso. One group of people seemed to stand out. They were dressed in white with a red plus insignia on their left shoulder. A small round machine with the same insignia hovered along behind them. Anyone that was found as being wounded, they pulled from the groups, some that were wounded in the final battle with the Viril battleship as they entered the Sol FTL Gate. She still couldn't get a good look at their faces. A throat was cleared near the interior blast doors as Lori spotted the small form of a humanoid reptilian only 6 hands tall. It cleared its throat again, and with a flick of its small tail another humanoid biped in a black and gray combat suit stepped forward, and with a very loud clang, as they stomped a heavy metal boot and shouted, "Attention!" Almost instantly she and the other Orions went silent, their attention riveted to the small cluster of aliens arrayed in front of them. She could see various species represented and found herself idly wondering if her first impression of humanity had been from a human. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander," said the small reptilian alien in a slightly nasal voice. "I am Sergeant Crom. We have been ordered to get you folks settled in for transport to more accommodating conditions." Sergeant Crom paused for a moment, making sure everyone was understanding the translation before continuing. "Your wounded will be taken care of and treated as our own until they recover. Mrs. Valley," Sergeant Crom waved a small hand at the wounded VIP she was still near, and a very tall female alien that had almost sparkling green skin stepped forward, her limbs long and thin, in a white bodysuit that had a red plus emblazoned on the left shoulder. Several others dressed similarly to her cautiously followed her as she pulled out some sort of small flat device and ran it over the VIP before motioning to two of the smaller aliens and ordering them to do something in a voice and language that sounded like tinkling bells to Lori's sensitive ears. As Miss Valley and her team of healers worked through the crowd of Orions, Sergeant Crum continued. "Now, let's continue by saying welcome to the United Sol Alliance territories. As you can tell, the U.S. Alliance has several member species and governments. I am a Jabalix. Miss Valley is an Eladrin, and the Lieutenant Commander is human." Lori's eyes immediately snapped back to the man in black and gray combat armor as he stood at attention slightly behind and to the left of Sergeant Crom. "We are not all of the U.S. Alliance member species," she paused. "I am sure you will eventually meet us all. Now if you would form two lines here and here." As Sergeant Crom spoke, a strip of light lit up on one side of the blast doors, and as she finished, another set on the other side lit up. "We will see you to a bunk, something to eat, and then your debriefing. Don't worry, we just want to know what is going on. There are no right or wrong answers. We already have most of the ship's logs, so this is just to follow protocol." Sergeant Crum waited for a few moments before adding, "Move, people. We have many more pods to retrieve and space is limited." With that, Lori found herself joining the rest of the people from her pod and forming into the desired lines, and soon found they were moving farther into the ship and down several decks. The human ship was very plain with no artistic flair. Everything was solely for a purpose and built to last. An Orion ship's corridors may have been arrayed in a similar layout. They would have had beautiful curves and even aesthetically pleasing geometric patterns anywhere not needed for a system or station. Most doors they passed had numbers or weird letters, and sometimes both. They were eventually led to what Sergeant Crum called a mess hall, and shown a rather large room with the designation 104B right next to the mess hall that was arrayed with bunks and two lockers at the end of each set of beds. Their group was informed on meal times, shown how to access the necessities, and then went through the debriefing. All in all, Lori found the ordeal to be over within a few hours. Everyone had been processed, and she had even received a fancy bracelet and shown how to access its basic functions. It was a small personal data chit. This would have cost her nearly 2 years of payback on Farsi. The Sol Alliance had already integrated the Orion language and alphabet into their system, so she could see many of the other Orions sitting about the mess hall reading whatever had caught their attention on the Sol Gal net. She had picked a table away from everyone, her thoughts on the current situation she found herself in warring with the sorrowful memories of the last few cycles. She picked at the plate of something she couldn't even start to identify, but the woman with the white cap had called it goulash, remembering when she had been picked to get on one of the 3 ships. Her mother, father, and older siblings had not been picked. She had just had her name day and been granted permission to participate in the great matching ceremony that essentially would allow her to start her family and pick a suitable mate. She was at the Temple of Halleck, having just donated the required amount of foxwool and tuardanium, which had taken a year to procure, and received her license when it was reported the first swarm ships had dropped off freighters from the Sagoth brood system and landed on Farsi's southern continent. A low growl escaped as she remembered the news reports and the images of the butchered Orions. Initially, the authorities had thought the brood ships were unsuspecting hosts, having unwittingly carried them into the Orion system. They mostly thought this because the freighters didn't run after the swarm ships detached from their hulls and dropped into the atmosphere. No, they had instead waited for most of the Farsi home fleet to be busy trying to intercept a dozen large asteroids that had suddenly been detected moving from the outer system directly into Farsi's orbital path. Once the main force was occupied with the asteroids, the freighters, which were the old long-haul sublight hulls with modified hyperdrives allowing them to use the gates, had suddenly blown out sections of their hulls, revealing some sort of new plasma cannons that were already spooled up and aimed at the unsuspecting orbital defense platforms, and to everyone's horror, the 2 platforms that defended the Sol FTL Gate were destroyed piecemeal. The view of the combined Viril, Sagoth brood, and the swarm fleets exiting out of the gate and descending on the Farsi home fleet and their brave sacrifice to allow as many civilians to escape would forever be burned into her memory. as well as the image of Farsi in ruins as the 3 ships laden with skeleton crews and as many civilians of viable reproductive age as the regent could get into the new experimental ships. They had been sitting behind the second moon Boida along with the destroyer Kagan, and 5 other cruisers which were shredded trying to defend them inside the FTL lanes, so they were the only military ships able to respond to the regent's evacuation call along with many brave merchant ships which probably didn't make it. She had taken a few bites and found herself savoring the goulash. It was quite good. "Mind if I join you?" came a deep baritone voice. She looked up and to her surprise, standing in front of her on the other side of the table was a bipedal humanoid with 2 small patches of fur on its primate-like face. He wore black and gray military fatigues with a black hexagonal patch prominently displaying 3 stripes and a delta insignia on his gray collar. After an uncomfortable moment of staring into his bright blue eyes, she replied, "Yes, yes of course." She gestured to the bench on the other side of the table. How had she understood him? "Thanks." He sat down and extended a hand over his food. "Name's Tim Reynolds." She had seen this greeting on her data chit and tentatively took his hand to shake it up and down slightly in the alien's weird greeting gesture. Why couldn't they just flick their ears like her people? "Lori," was all she replied. She hadn't chosen a mate yet, so in her culture she couldn't take a second name. He sat down and began to eat. She had wondered how the utensils wrapped in some sort of soft fiber pressed into a sheet were used. She had known basically what the dull knife was, though why it was dull still escaped her. She had figured the pronged instrument was for stabbing, but without context and with a dull knife, she had resorted to what every other Orion had opted to do. What was natural, they had used their fingers. But seeing Tim use them, she quickly adapted and before long had the basics down on holding them and their use. "So where are you from?" he asked before taking a bite of his food. Her mind immediately went to the last image of her home planet she had seen through the viewport. She knew she had only been let on a ship because she had been lucky. She had been grabbed, scanned, and crammed into one of the ships. "Farsi," she said meekly, remembering the craters that had been once beautiful cities suspended above vibrant purple rainforests on massive supports. She could still see the plasma burning large swaths of it as they obliterated strong points the Orion army had set up to at least slow the bugs' ground assault. No warning, no declaration of war. No reason was given. One moment the Orions were long-standing trade partners with the Hive Confederacy, the next they were locked in a full-scale war. The worst part had been nobody could reach the VAT system, the next Orion-inhabited system, and a naval outpost to warn them. And of the dozen courier ships sent out to ask our allies for assistance, none was received before they had finally escaped the system through an old, very rarely used gate, but had been heading away from Orion space. The man cleared his throat and in a solemn tone said, "Sorry Lori. I didn't mean to bring up any bad memories." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly at a loss as to what to say, and she still couldn't understand how she could understand him. "How can I understand you?" she asked. "And you can understand me?" He just nodded at the last part as he stuck a small tube through a juice box and slurped a couple of times as he appeared to be deep in thought. "Yep. Whenever you were issued your communicator," he pointed at her, "did you feel a small prick as you synced it tight?" As she nodded, now looking at her communicator, he continued, "That was your standard personal nanites." She looked up, puzzled by the word. "Nanites?" she asked. She had never heard of whatever that was. The briefing had said that they had or would receive them, but not where or how or what they were. Taking the question for what it was, Tim began. "They are microscopic robots programmed to automatically repair damaged tissue and fight diseases and viruses common throughout known space. As soon as they entered your bloodstream, they began reproducing and will lay dormant there until needed. Since I have my own nanites, we can communicate without much delay. To an outsider without nanites, you are speaking your native language and I am speaking English. But we hear the words and to a minor extent feel what some psychic races say." She stared at him for a moment, processing what he had just told her. These people were years ahead of hers in technology. She looked back down at the data chit and said, "Amazing." That was all she could get out, as not a heartbeat later a proximity klaxon wailed as a mechanical female voice chimed, "Warning! Proximity alert. Unidentified hostile ship detected." It repeated itself. All the Orions in the mess hall were looking around nervously as others rushed out, she assumed to hurry to their duty stations. Tim, though, didn't budge. He just casually slurped his juice box and absently typed something a few times on his communicator, and he was suddenly looking at a screen depicting the outside of the ship. It wasn't disorienting because there was no up or down in space. Only where you or your target were in relation to each other. She could see a sleek black spider-like craft on his projected screen. Its engines were at full burn as it headed towards what looked like another FTL gate. This gate was very busy and Lori could see cargo freighters lined up in queue, a greenish-blue planet with pink splotches in the background. What the hell is that? Tim asked no one in particular. She remembered seeing these ships above Farsi or dropping onto it in a sneak attack. I think that is a swarm ship. By all the reports from the ground back on my home planet, that ship has several queens on board and an entire battalion of broodlings. She was still looking at his communicator's holographic image and the planet in the background. You can't let them reach a planet. Her voice suddenly rose in a panic. If that ship reaches that planet, there wouldn't be any way of stopping the brood from establishing a colony. Once a single colony was established, they would begin systematically stripping the planet of biomass to rapidly increase their numbers, becoming a plague of the worst kind. Oh, they aren't going anywhere. He extended his arm to provide her a better angle as a silver-winged vehicle zipped by, closely followed by 3 more. Lori could tell the broodling ship was much larger than the silver ship, but the United Sol ships were quickly gaining on the much larger enemy ship. Soon one of the silver ships shot the spider-like ship with what looked like a laser. One shot and she could see its sublight engines splutter and fail. Within a few heartbeats, 3 of the 4 ships appeared to attach themselves to the larger spider-like vessel of the broodlings. Those Marines just had their day made. They get to play for a change instead of being stuck on a ship. He chuckled as she caught the glint of his canines as he smiled a definite predatory smile. Those are broodlings and potentially a few of their viril allies. She gulped. They tore our defenses apart. They are very dangerous, you should warn them. She looked back at the communicator. Even these Marines deserve a chance to live. Calm down, miss, Tim said with a sudden grin spreading wider across his face if it was possible, his white teeth flashing. I can almost guarantee you that the scariest thing in that cluster of ships is the Terran Marines. He started shaking his head. No, those poor bastards are having more fun than they have had in a few cycles. The certainty in his voice and his demeanor caused her to relax somewhat. Just how strong was this Sol alliance, she wondered as she watched the communicator and finished her goulash. She found it quite good compared to the minimal rations she had been eating on the Orion ship. She couldn't help but wonder yet again as to just what kind of people were these humans. Had they found an ally, or would the US alliance end up being where her people's story ended? Looking across the table at the young human slurping on his juice box, she couldn't help but wonder which way this would go. Thanks for listening. Please leave a like and hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the story. If you feel generous and want to support the author's work, go visit the Patreon link in the description. Any support is welcome. Until next time.